Well, hi there. My name is Ian Gotts. For this Trailhead session, we're going to talk about the implementation lifecycle. And as summer seems to have arrived in California, I thought I'd wear my most Californian shirt. And also, we've got a little bit of a different background. Normally, we have my trusty Fender-based guitar, but today we've got my old Ibanez, which is covered in Trailhead and other Salesforce stickers. So a bit of a different background today, but we've still got the same sign. So, oh, the sign's over there, isn't it? Right, so we're going to talk about the implementation life cycle and the skills that you need to go around that life cycle. And it's something that more and more people in the ecosystem are talking about. Why? Because Salesforce has moved from being a tactical application to becoming a very strategic application inside organizations. We need to take a more rigorous approach to implementation. No longer can we simply build a few objects, get a few users on board and get going. There are huge implications now in making changes. So therefore, we need to think about the whole implementation lifecycle. Now, this doesn't mean that it needs to be massively time consuming. You can still implement changes relatively quickly, but we need to make sure we've gone through this rigorous process. So I want to spend a little bit of time looking at the cycle, but then thinking about the skill sets that you'll need, either you will need or you'll need to get from your colleagues to make sure you navigate around this cycle as quickly as possible, but as safely as possible. So I think about the life cycle in terms of four phases. The analyze phase, which is all about capturing and understanding the requirements. The build phase, obviously building, coding the application. Deliver, which is about loading data and actually getting it into production. And then the operate phase, which is where we're monitoring it in production, we're getting feedback, and then we can go around that cycle again. So a couple of things. First of all, we need to make sure that whatever we're building is maximizing the level of adoption. There's no point building applications if people aren't using them. Salesforce licenses are extremely expensive if nobody's using them. But the more applications, the more users we can get using those licenses, the better the return on investment. But with the current environment, with COVID, businesses are having to iterate to find that perfect business model. And every business requires its systems, such as Salesforce, to make sure that they stay agile. So therefore, we need to go around this implementation cycle as quickly as possible. So that means we go through the analyze, build, deliver, and operate phases quickly. That doesn't mean we can miss steps out. And that means that we also need to deliver these systems with a level of trust. It's no point in rushing a release out only to find that something breaks and we have to go and back it back out. So those three things, adoption, agility, and trust, means that we need to go around this implementation life cycle quickly. But spoiler alert here, you can't miss any steps out. Every one of those steps is important, even if it's a relatively small change. So as we implement, there are a series of documents that we're creating that get used and reused as we go around the cycle. But if we think about the analyze phase, we're capturing requirements, we're mapping business processes, we're modeling data, we're doing org analysis. That's all going to get reused in the build phase, where the user stories are the critical document that the developers or the admins need to go and build the applications. But then we are adding documentation. We need to test. So we're testing against the user stories, but for user acceptance testing, we're testing against the process maps because that was what the business designed. When we start thinking about deliver, we're reusing, obviously, the application that's been built because that's what we're testing and deploying, but we're also then using the data models and the org analysis to understand how to do the data load. We are releasing both the processes and the new application into production. And then in the operate phase, we're using the process diagrams we've drawn if we're in a regulated environment to make sure that our end users are clear about what their requirements are from a regulatory perspective. We're also using the processes and maybe some of the notes, URL links, screenshots, whatever, as part of training. And then we go around that cycle again. So part of accelerating this cycle is making sure that we don't have silos of documentation. We're not creating our requirements in a spreadsheet, then creating our user stories in a different spreadsheet, then passing that to Jira or Agile Accelerator or Rally, recreating those user stories and taking those out and then putting them into another application. Then we start building test material in yet another application. We then take that content and then we build training material. So there's a lot of reuse that can be accelerate this life cycle. That's the first thing. The second thing is we're going to go around this cycle multiple times. There's not just one implementation. So if we can reuse the documentation, build on those process diagrams, make sure that the analysis is easier because we've already documented the changes we've made, then we can go around this cycle more quickly. And importantly, with trust, we're not going to break anything. So think about how you break down the silos across these different areas and the documentation that flows from area to area. So if I think about the handoffs from one phase to another, I think one of the important things we've discovered is that you shouldn't leave one phase until you're really clear that you've finished that phase. So you shouldn't finish the analyze phase until you've actually got crisp user stories which genuinely represent what the users need, not what they thought they wanted. Rushing into the build phase will slow you down longer term. And I know it's very tempting to want to get into build. I'm the same. Salesforce is so much fun to go and build stuff. You want to rush into build, but you need to resist that. You need to resist the end users going, why haven't you built something? You should be there going, I need to have a better understanding about what you need before I can build it. Because if I build the wrong things, you won't use it. It will come back and bite us in terms of adoption. So only when you've got those crisp user stories should you then be going into the build phase. I think it's obvious that you shouldn't be leaving the build phase unless you've actually got a tested application. But we need to test it not just from a unit test perspective, but from a user acceptance test perspective. Is it fulfilling the requirements that the business users wanted? And obviously in the deliver phase, we haven't delivered until we have a released app, but also the released documentation that goes with it, the training material, the supporting process documentation if that's what's required in the regulated environment. So when we release, we need to make sure that all gets released at the same time. Obviously, the operate phase doesn't necessarily have an end date. Operate is something which continuously happens, but we move from operate into analyze when we get feedback and we have issues around adoption, which we need to go and address. So again, we need a way of capturing that feedback so we can then start the cycle again. So none of this should be rocket science. I think many of you will recognize and probably do all these steps. The biggest issue that I think we find if I think about the org confessions and the root cause analysis is poor business analysis. Therefore, people rush into build. In this stage, probably poor consideration of architecture, which comes back to bite people later. Lack of documentation, which again causes problems in terms of impact analysis. The other issue we saw in terms of the or confessions is that there isn't a well understood or consistently understood way of actually driving around this cycle. So one of the things that we've built is the process maps for how we implement our own org. Elements has obviously uses Salesforce, but we've been around Salesforce for the last 20 years using Salesforce, and we've evolved our operational processes to go around this cycle to a point where we modestly claim that we have probably the best run org on the planet. But rather than just bragging about it, we've actually made all those process diagrams freely available. So any one of you can look at them, either adopt them or take them and modify them for your own use. So again, they're contributing to the ecosystem. We think we do a great job. I can also tell you that we release 40 change requests a week. So we are constantly evolving our application, and we go around this cycle. It may take only an hour to go around or 10 minutes to go around for a small change, but we are going around this cycle rigorously and touching all the different steps. So let's look at the first phase, analyze. So there's quite a lot happening here. We are obviously capturing feedback from the end users. We are then taking that feedback and turning them into business requirements. We're mapping business processes. We're doing some data modeling. We're having to develop user stories. And at the same time, we're trying to understand the risk to the org of making those changes. so that we can put some risk analysis on the user story and some risk analysis on the release. And based on the risk of our releases, we can take maybe different development paths. The highest level of risk, we need to go through the formal multiple sandboxes all the way through to production. But a very low risk, we put straight into production because we know it's low risk. So quite a lot of terms there. I want to try and put some context around them and just show a little business flow about how we think about each of these different types of activity. So up here, green, coming out of the operate phase, we've got end users submitting feedback. Actually, at the same time, we may have optimization opportunities. There may be some tech debt that we need to go and fix. Those all get fed into our ability to then capture requirements. So feedback will turn into some business requirements. Those business requirements we may push back to end users and go, I need more information here. Added to those requirements, we will also probably get statement of work, suggestions, random wishes, maybe a few gems. And as many of you have heard me talk before, those requirements are raw requirements. What we actually need to do is validate them and then identify whether there are new requirements that the end users have forgotten. And to do that, that's where we start mapping out our business processes. And that will then prioritize, triage the requirements that have come in, and it will identify new requirements. Once we've finished doing that process mapping, we then have a set of final business requirements. Those are not the requirements we'd send through to our development teams because we need to write user stories, which are essentially the technical requirements of what needs to be built. So we're writing user stories, and at the same time, we're looking at that user story risk, and we're looking at the risk from three perspectives. Operational risk, how much the business is going to change. Technical risk, what is likely to break in the org, and regulatory change. If we make these changes, are we going to break any or fall foul of any regulatory compliance? That, combined with an understanding about what we need to go and build in the org, will then give us a risk analysis, which then will be sent with the user story into the development phase. Now, I went through that relatively quickly. There are some other Trailhead Live recordings of taking this whole analysis phase in a lot more detail, so you start to understand how that all operates. So let's move into build. As we said, build starts with some crisp user stories and it's finished when we have a tested app. So some of the key skills that we need to know when we're here is architecture design. There is a new architecture certification, there's a new architecture mascot, Ruth the Elephant. There's also a great blog that the architecture team have started populating. So architecture is really important as we're building relatively complex and strategic applications in Salesforce. And just like architecture in houses, you start building a house, don't realize that it's going to have 3 floors and don't put anywhere for the stairs. It's going to be pretty hard to put those stairs in later. So those architecture decisions need to be made up front to make sure that we're not going to have to try and re-architect the system, which is going to be particularly painful downstream. Obviously, there's declarative coding. We call that configure. The great sessions on low-code love. I'd encourage all of you to seek out that hashtag and start looking at some of the presentations about the great tools that Salesforce has around declarative development. Obviously, not everything can be declarative development. Some things need to be coded. Maybe that's Salesforce in terms of like Lightning Web Components. But also now Salesforce isn't an island. We're connecting it to other systems, and some of those integrations need to be coded. And then finally here we've got testing, both manual and automated testing. There are some automated test tools, but obviously you need to think about some of the manual testing as well, user acceptance testing. The one thing I haven't put on the list here is documentation. I'm assuming everyone realizes that in all of these different steps, we need to be tracking why we're making the changes. Not what we've done, but more importantly, why we did it, why we made those decisions, why we made those architecture decisions, why we made those declarative, all those coding decisions. So on to the next phase, deliver. So a bit of terminology here, some acronyms: ALM, Application Lifecycle Management; CI/CD, which is Continuous Integration, Continuous Deployment, or DevOps. And again, a lot's been written about this now. Again, the whole principle of CI/CD is becoming more popular. DevOps has been a term that's been around the IT industry for a number of years. There's a great book here by Andrew Davis called Mastering Sales DevOps. And the forward was by Wade Wegner, who's from Salesforce. But again, a huge amount of information around how to actually drive a DevOps cycle, thinking about multiple sandboxes and driving through a deployment pipeline, the sort of metrics that you need to measure to understand how to improve your CI/CD cycle. The other area obviously is data load and migration. Again, more complex implementations of Salesforce means we've got more complex data models. So again, we need to think more carefully in terms of that data load, that migration and the testing. And then finally, part of that CI/CD is all about release management. So not just people like Andrew's books, but there's quite a lot inside Trailhead to help you understand application lifecycle management. And there's a screenshot from the trail on ALM. So into the last phase, operate. So this is where we're now running our Salesforce applications. Our end users are using them. Hopefully adoption is going through the roof. Often that's not the case. So again, some of the things we need to think about is how do we change or drive up user adoption? I always remember Mike Gerhold talking about management by walking around. Sadly, we can't do that with COVID, but we can certainly monitor what our Salesforce users are doing. We can see which screens are being most frequently used. We can also start to think about how we optimize those screens, how we can clean them up, how we can add more help, how we can maybe use validation rules to improve the data quality, how we can move fields to make it easier for our end users to go and use those page layouts. Obviously, the fewer fields, less confusion for the end users, the faster the pages load. No one wants to see a page layout that looks like a CVS receipt. It just goes on and on and on. So again, things like if we're in Lightning, dynamic pages means that we can start to maybe hide some of those fields away and only pop them up when they're required. So again, there are lots of different techniques here in terms of improving the end user experience. And that's why we're driving this feedback and adoption link back into requirements. So we identify new optimization ideas. They will be part of the feedback, or user requirements will start to feed the cycle again. Clearly, backup and restore is an important thing. I will say that nobody pays for backup. Everyone pays for restore. Backup doesn't matter. What matters is, can you restore the data? So it's not just, oh, we backed it up, but how often do you test that restore still works? You've added new objects, you've changed data structures. Does the restore process that you put in place, does that still work? And the final piece is regulatory compliance. And this is more than just, do we have data privacy in place? This is also, for some industries, are our end users following due process? So if you're on food and pharma, oil and gas, financial services, you'll be well aware of the fines. Particularly if I think about the food and pharma world, the FDA are pretty aggressive in terms of some of the fines. I remember back a while ago that they fined the American Red Cross $300 million, and the pharma companies each year somebody goes, okay, it's my turn, and there's $1 billion fine. So regulatory compliance is very real. It's making sure that people are following due process. But it also, in a number of ways, is quite good because it focuses the mind on, are we getting our end users to use the applications? And if we're not, then we've got a great stick there to say, look, we need more investment in making sure our applications support our end users, because of the concern of regulatory compliance and the fines associated with it. So some key takeaways from this session. First of all, the implementation lifecycle clearly requires different skill sets. If you're a solo admin, that means you are wearing many hats. Obviously, if you're working in teams, then it means that you need to understand what the handoffs are between you and the different groups. So I think everyone, no matter what discipline you're in, needs to understand the entire implementation lifecycle and then where you fit in it. So if you're a business analyst, Yet maybe you're only working in the analyze phase, but you need to understand the implications of build, deliver, and operate. If you're a developer, then understanding where those requirements are coming from, understanding the analyze phase. So therefore, everyone needs to understand the implementation lifecycle. Clearly, if you're in a big organization with multiple teams, then you're going to be focused on a particular skill set. If you're solo admin, relatively small teams, then you can be wearing those different hats. Fortunately, next slide, there's quite a lot of resources around to help you gain those skills. And obviously the ecosystem is massively supportive in terms of helping you gain those skills, whether it's through community groups, through posting on Slack or the Twitter channels. My email details are at the very beginning of this, on the very first slide, ian@elements.cloud, or hit me up on Twitter. I'm always happy to have these conversations. So that's the first thing. Second thing is we need to think about how we accelerate the implementation. That's about reuse of documentation. It's about streamlining the implementation. I said we've made all our process documentation about how we do that implementation lifecycle freely available. Anybody can access that. You just create an Elements account and go into the demo area, and you can look at the process maps, copy them away, and then go and use them for your own use. But the important thing is you accelerate that implementation by reuse of documentation and clear process, not by skipping steps. You can't skip any of those steps out. They're all required. You may only spend 5 or 10 minutes on one of them, but you still have to do that. Then the last point is that we're now building strategic applications which require strong foundations. So these skills I've talked about are foundational skills. Right? Those architecture skills, critically important. Analysis skills, critically important. Being able to maximize your use of the platform through either declarative or code, critical skills. Understanding the deployment pipeline, critical skills. The good thing is that many of these skills are completely transferable. So as your company starts to implement other applications, be that Pardot, Marketing Cloud, Workday, ServiceNow, the things we're talking about are equally applicable to implementing any of those other applications. So these skills will actually help you build your career. So not only are you building strong foundations for the application, but you're building strong foundations for your career. So I promised you some resources for how you can skill up in each of these different areas. For the analyze phase, I've been doing a series of these Trailhead Live recordings every Wednesday at 10 o'clock around business analysis, requirements capture. Those are available at train.elements.cloud. There's also a very active Trailblazer community called Salesforce Business Analysts that is run by Tony Martin, and she's doing a fantastic job in terms of helping skill up the admin community in terms of the analysis skills. In terms of build, clearly this is where probably Salesforce is strongest, I would suggest, with certifications such as admin, developer certifications, the new architect certification, and there's a new Trailblazer community called Customer Architect. There's also a link there to a blog where they're getting some people to write some great articles about architecture. And obviously there's a new mascot, Ruth the elephant, and there's a great deal of energy being put into this architecture area. In terms of build, there's clearly Trailhead, a series of Trailhead modules, trails. Some of the things I think people need to start focusing on is obviously security, flow, where that's becoming really important in terms of where we're building bigger user groups. So therefore we need to get the security model right. Flow in terms of how do we start to build out that automation to make sure that end users are having to do less work. And obviously there's hashtag low code love. There were a series of sessions a month or so ago where they were running sessions about how to get more out of the platform without coding. In terms of deliver, there are some Trailhead modules. If you search for ALM, Application Lifecycle Management, search for Release Management or DevOps. Again, there's a lot of information out there, so you need to pick carefully through that. So I start with the ALM trail. There's also, if you do hashtag DevOps days, there are some of the integration release management providers have been running DevOps days, people like Capado. Again, bringing together a number of the experts in that area in terms of what it takes to drive CI/CD, the sort of metrics you need to do a great job there. In terms of Operate, Trailhead has got one user adoption trail, which is really good, worth reading. And we've extended that on the train.elements.cloud site with some other thoughts about how you drive up user adoption. So as always, thank you so much for joining me for this Trailhead Live session. If you have other questions, please find me at ian@elements.cloud or at Ian Gotts on Twitter. Really happy to continue these discussions. As you know, my passion is about educating the ecosystem and the community so we can all do a better job. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.